If I were to ask you to identify the language written in each of these three images, what would your answer be? Most likely, you would say that the first one is obviously ancient Egyptian, the next one looks like Greek, and the third is definitely Arabic. At first glance, that may be the reasonable answer, but in actuality, all of these are the same Egyptian text written in different scripts. You see, Egyptian is the longest attested human language, having survived for more than 4,000 years of history. Like any language, Egyptian developed with time, not only in the way it was spoken, but also in the scripts used to write it. While most of us are familiar with the Egyptian hieroglyphic script, this was by no means the only script used to write Egyptian. In this video, we will briefly analyze the evolution of the Egyptian language and its written scripts, from the hieroglyphic script to the Hieratic, to the demotic, to the Coptic, Arabic, and finally the Latin script. To start off, let us take a look at the different stages of the Egyptian language. These stages of the Egyptian language can be divided into two large groups: earlier Egyptian and later Egyptian. Earlier Egyptian can be further divided into Archaic Egyptian, which is the earliest form of the language and was used during the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods; Old Egyptian, which was the dominant form of the language during the Old Kingdom period; and finally, Middle Egyptian. This was the form of the language most common during the Middle Kingdom. It would also persist as the standard literary language of Egypt all through the New Kingdom, and would remain the liturgical language of the ancient Egyptian religion until its decline in the 4th century AD. Because of how long it remained in use, it could also be further divided into subforms such as Middle Egyptian proper, Late Middle Egyptian, and Neo-Middle Egyptian. The second group, Later Egyptian, developed from the colloquial and informal dialects spoken during the later half of the New Kingdom. Its earliest standardized form, known as Medio-Late Egyptian, would supplant Middle Egyptian as both the literary language and everyday language of Egypt during the New Kingdom. This would later develop into Late Egyptian, then Demotic Egyptian, and then Coptic Egyptian, the final form of the Egyptian language. While the Egyptian language went extinct as a colloquial and literary language sometime following the 14th century AD, Coptic Egyptian continues to survive today as the liturgical language of the Christian churches of Egypt, namely the Coptic Orthodox Church and the Coptic Catholic Church. Now that we have covered the spoken stages of the language, let's take a deeper look at the written forms of Egyptian. The oldest, most well-known, and longest surviving of the Egyptian scripts is hieroglyphic. The earliest forms of the hieroglyphic script are dated to about 3200 BC, and the last known hieroglyphic inscription, known as the Graffito of Esmet Achum, was carved by a pagan priest in 394 AD. The native Egyptian name for the script means God's words. During the Ptolemaic period, the script would be called hieroglyphikos in Greek, which can be interpreted as the sacred writing. This was most likely a direct translation of the Egyptian name into Greek. It's from this name that we derive the English term hieroglyphic. The Egyptian hieroglyphic script consisted of stylized characters representing everyday objects, flora, and fauna of the Nile Valley. These characters evolved from the pre-literate artistic traditions of pre-dynastic Egypt. At its full maturity, the hieroglyphic script had over 1,000 unique characters. These characters could be interpreted in three distinct ways: as phonograms, as logograms, or as determinatives. Each character could express one or more phonemes similar to an alphabet or syllabary. These were usually consonants, and vowels were not recorded, similar to Semitic scripts today. The majority of characters within a text would be used phonetically, spelling out names and words. Since multiple characters produced the same sound, or combination of sounds, this made it so that there were countless ways of spelling each name or word. This would allow for artistic freedom. It also allowed for clarification on word pronunciation. For example, when writing the word nefer, meaning beautiful, the scribe could use the triliteral for the three sounds N, F, and R. He could also complement this triliteral by separate uniliteral characters for F and R. These extra complementary characters would not be pronounced, but would serve to clarify the pronunciation of the triliteral character. Logographic interpretation was most commonly used in reference to nouns. The character would be accompanied by a single stroke, signifying that it was to be interpreted as a logogram and not phonetically. In many cases, when there were homophones, the phonetic interpretation would be used for one homophone and the other logographic interpretation would be used for the other, such as with disher, which means flamingo, and red, with both words being homophones in Egyptian. Finally, some characters can be used as determinatives. These were used to distinguish between homophones and give extra context about meanings of words. For example, there is a determinative in Queen Nefertiti's name that indicates her status as a queen. As mentioned, this character would not be pronounced, but would simply help give more information about the written word, clarifying that it was the name of a queen. Another example would be the word Nefer, meaning beauty, which we are familiar with from the name of Queen Nefertiti. The word can refer to many things. However, by adding determinatives, we can narrow down which object we are calling beautiful. For example, by adding the beer jug determinative from the name of beer and the plural determinative, we can clarify that the word is referring to alcoholic drinks. By adding the feminine ending t, signified by a loaf of bread, and then the determinative of a young woman, we can clarify that we are referring to a young woman as beautiful. To add to the confusion, hieroglyphs could be written in multiple directions, from right to left, or left to right, from top to bottom, or even from bottom to top. The ever-increasing number of characters also made it nearly impossible to standardize. By the Ptolemaic period, there were several thousand characters. These many unique features of the hieroglyphic script made it a highly artistic and beautiful script, fitting for writing official and religious texts and decorating public spaces and monuments. These features, however, made it nearly impossible to use for normal communication. As a result, the Egyptian scribes and priests developed shorthand and cursive forms of hieroglyphs meant for less formal texts. Two of these descendant scripts are known to us today, hieratic and cursive hieroglyphs. Hieratic was the most influential of the two. It simplified the forms of the characters so that they were easier to write. Hieratic also limited writing to be from right to left and also introduced diacritical markings to distinguish between similar-looking characters. The last known hieratic text was composed in the 3rd century AD. Around the 7th century BC, a further simplified version of the Lower Egyptian hieratic script would begin to be used in less formal contexts. The ancient Egyptians would call this script document writing. The Greek historian Herodotus referred to it as demotikos, or popular. This is where its modern name, demotic, comes from. The name demotic would be applied to both the script and the stage of Egyptian spoken by the public at that time. Demotic further simplified the forms of the characters. It also made the uniliteral characters more standardized, so that the majority of any text consisted of this pseudo-alphabet. Greek and Latin loanwords also began to make their way into Egyptian during this period, spelled out with the demotic letters. As demotic became more popular, it began to replace hieratic completely with regards to informal writing. A pattern then emerged where demotic was used in writing down everyday language, while hieratic was reserved for use by priests in copying and preserving religious texts. It is from this exclusive use by priests that hieratic gets its name. When Saint Clement of Alexandria, the dean of the famous Coptical school of Alexandria, made reference to the two cursive scripts, he called demotic the letter writing, while the older script he called grammata hieratica, meaning priestly writing, since it had continued to be used by the pagan priests up to his time in the 2nd century. At the same time that the Egyptians were working on simplifying hieroglyphs into a simpler script more suitable for common writing, foreigners who traded with Egypt had begun doing the same. The Semites living in Sinai during the Bronze Age adopted a simplified form of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. This new writing system would spread through Canaan up to Phoenicia. The Phoenicians would adapt and improve this script into the Phoenician abjad. The Phoenician abjad would be spread east and west, fathering the majority of modern scripts, from the Brahmanic scripts of East Asia to the Arabic, Hebrew, and Aramic scripts of the Middle East, and even the Greek, Latin, and Cyrillic scripts of Europe. All of these were derived from the Egyptian hieroglyphic script. During the late period, trade with Greece increased, and the first permanent Greek settlement in Egypt would be founded at Naucratis in the 6th century. This would be the only Greek colony until the 3rd century BC, when the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty, ruled over Egypt in the wake of the Macedonian Empire. New Greek cities were established, and slowly Greek became the language of government in Egypt. The increased contact with the Greeks began a new phenomenon in Egypt. The Egyptians, having a tradition of difficult-to-learn scripts, began adapting the Greek script, itself a descendant of the Egyptian hieroglyphic script, to write the informal texts of the Egyptian language. This new script is what we today call the Coptic script. Its first traces began with the first Greek colony in Egypt, and it continues to this day to be the main script used for the latest stage of the Egyptian language, also called Coptic. The use of Greek letters in writing the Egyptian language was especially popular for magical texts detailing religious rites and practices. These texts depended on the proper pronunciation of magical names and spells, and since demotic was still extremely difficult to read, some of the hard-to-read words would be transcribed with Greek letters to aid in their pronunciation. While the Coptic script originated in the 6th century for transliterating and clarifying names and single words, entire texts composed in Coptic started appearing by the 1st century AD, mixing in some demotic letters for sounds not found in the Greek alphabet. Although the last demotic inscription was made in 452 AD, demotic had largely given way to Coptic by the start of the 3rd century AD. This was mainly thanks to a new religion that was spreading rapidly across the Mediterranean, Christianity. At first, Christianity was confined to the Greek-speaking urban centers. However, by the 2nd century, the Church of Alexandria began an effort to preach among the native Egyptians in rural Egypt. This effort was spearheaded by St. Pantaenus, who was the dean of the Catechistical School of Alexandria. He began his efforts of preaching by translating the Bible into the Egyptian language, using the Coptic alphabet. By using the Coptic alphabet, he ensured that the Bible would be easy to read and interpret. Other Christian texts would continue to be written in the Coptic alphabet, and the other Egyptian scripts began to be viewed negatively by the Christians of Egypt due to their continued use by the pagans. As the Christians began outnumbering the pagans of Egypt in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, the other scripts became extinct, leaving Coptic as the sole legible Egyptian script. While early forms of Coptic included numerous demotic carryovers, the final form of the script retains only 7. These letters survived because they had no equivalent Greek phonemes. Following the Islamic conquest of Egypt in the 7th century AD, a new language was introduced, Arabic. The Arabs did not suddenly force their language upon the natives of Egypt, but as time went, a slow but effective campaign of Arabization took place. By the 13th century, we begin seeing the translation of Coptic texts into Arabic and the production of bilingual manuscripts containing both languages. We also begin to see the production of Arabic textbooks, dictionaries, and grammar books for the Coptic language, indicating that a lingual shift was taking place and that Coptic speakers were now in the minority. Not long after, we begin seeing some liturgical books introduce Coptic written in an adapted form of the Arabic script in order to make it easier on the supplicants to pray the liturgy in Coptic. This step indicated that Coptic had been relegated to a liturgical language and that the majority of the clergy and elites who could afford euchologions could no longer read the Coptic script properly, but needed help from the Arabic script to clarify pronunciation. Starting in the 19th century, 2 new trends also introduced the Coptic language to the Latin script. The first was the growing Western interest in Egyptology and Coptology. With the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, a race began to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphs. The person who was ultimately successful in this task, Jean-François Champollion, was aided in his decipherment by his knowledge and ability to read Coptic. After hieroglyphs were deciphered, the field of Egyptology boomed in popularity. In order to facilitate learning, all stages of the Egyptian language would be transcribed into Latin letters so that students of these fields would be able to learn and pronounce names and terms easily. Since the earlier Egyptian scripts are missing vowels, transliterations either ignored vowels, added arbitrary ones, or attempted to reconstruct them from later Egyptian. The second trend was the Coptic diaspora. As the Copts spread across the world, many traveled to nations where the Latin alphabet was the most common script. In these places, the Copts began writing Coptic in the Latin script for educational purposes, in order to facilitate teaching Coptic hymns and prayers to those who could not read the Coptic script. While the Coptic Church allows for the use of Egyptian written in modern and popular scripts for educational purposes, this practice is not extremely favorable. The Coptic Church, alongside Coptic lay organizations, have exerted much effort in reviving and promoting literacy in both the Coptic script and the Coptic language. Sadly, these efforts have yet to be met with success. And so, this concludes our brief discussion of the history and evolution of the Egyptian language and the Egyptian scripts.